Hello, welcome to this video, and on this video I'm going to be reviewing two albums. The first will be by Tim Bowness, his latest album, Powder Dry, which I have a lovely vinyl copy of here. And I will also be discussing this album by Soft Machine, their latest album, Other Doors. And this will become a regular thing. I am going to be trying to review new music on here, as well as discussing old music. Now, my criteria has become, it'll be music that I'm connected to in some way. I'm getting sent quite a few albums by different bands at the moment. I'm also sort of in a musical circle where my friends are bringing albums out. And in this case, this is an example where my friends have brought albums out. And not only my friends, but also the leader of a band I'm in. So I'm going to start with this Tim Bowness album and discuss this. Now, of course, you probably know that I play drums in Butterfly Mind, which is a band led by Tim Bowness. We actually did the gig in Camden, the album launch for this album. Now, this album is completely unlike what we play live in Butterfly Mind. And also, this album is questionable whether we could put this into the progressive rock genre. And so this is the very interesting question of what Tim is doing here, because I think what's interesting is I know Tim because I have played in progressive rock bands. And Tim is a staple on the progressive rock scene. He is one half of No Man with Steven Wilson. And of course, Steven Wilson is probably the most preeminent progressive rock musician of the last 25 years. He's the most important guy. And so you approach this of it being in the category of prog. I've listened to it twice now. I've just finished listening to it. Now it's still going round. Look, I've just finished listening to side 2 again, giving it some good thought. And I've done something that I haven't done for a long time, which only happens when you got a vinyl album. Is I've sat here and read through the lyrics as I was listening to the track. Let's put aside what genre it's in. Let's just talk about the album. This album was recorded by Tim. He's playing all the instruments on here. There seems to be a high degree of using digital audio workstation technology. He has done a lot of programming. And in its process and its sound, I would say it is taking its lead from the albums created by Brian Eno. The big difference is that Tim has a beautiful voice and he's a very strong songwriter, whereas Brian Eno is, I think, much more interested in process. But those processes that come from that neck of the woods is what we're hearing here. Now, that world of Brian Eno and Roxy Music and David Bowie and Japan and sort of the more experimental end of Robert Fripp, all that stuff, which sort of straddles the progressive rock of the 70s, and it takes the sort of experimentation and the search for future sounds and the use of technology and an aesthetic which is less based in sort of blues and funky soul aesthetics, and also then moves towards the 1980s. So there's a much more pop sensibility in there. Those are the values that you have on this album. This is what Tim is interested in exploring on here. So Tim is a songwriter who is working in this genre that's very influenced by the stuff I just described. In terms of the actual themes and meanings, this seems to keep referring back to me, and I've only just listened to it a couple of times, but it's referring to the idea of being hidden or being lost or disappearing. You know, it's obviously Timmy's a little bit older than me. And although he explores a whole range of sounds within this genre, it does seem to lament, and it seems to have a wintry feel to it. It's very apt listening to it, sat here watching the leaves falling from the trees. At certain moments, I'm taken to sort of English seaside holidays in the 1970s. At other moments, I can feel the cold wind of a sort of Yorkshire moor. But within all this is a whole ton of very, intense electronica sounds. There is a certain moment, I think it's my favourite track at the moment because it's probably the most visceral one, is a track called I Was There. When the drums kick in, you get this great big sort of almost like fuzzy techno bass line come in. The palette of sounds is brilliant, and it's all projected through this thing that, as you know, I call the English aesthetic. Tim Bowness embodies the English aesthetic. I can always remember when I was a kid that my dad, who was a big jazz and blues fan, he said he always respected Petula Clark. And the reason why he respected Petula Clark was because she was a British singer that sang in a British accent. This is a theme that I think is fundamentally the driver of progressive rock. Is this idea of American rock and roll styles channeled through an English aesthetic. And so there's certain points in here where it's almost like house music. There's certain moments like on I think Summer Turn where it's like a pop song. There's a couple of instrumentals on here. They're very short. All the tracks are very short. If I go through the track times, Rock Hudson, the first track is 2 minutes and 4 seconds. Then Lost is 2:09, and then 2:59, and then 2 minutes 50. And then I think we have an instrumental that is only 1 minute 18 seconds, followed by another track which is 1 minute 33 seconds. The tracks are really short. So what's interesting to me is Tim is exploring prog and anti-prog. There's pop elements in here, and there's these very short songs. I mean, songs that were 2 minutes long are really going back to the sort of beginnings of rock and roll. All those early rock and roll tracks in the 1950s were probably 2 minutes 20 seconds. Now, when I put these on, the effect this has, bearing in mind that I hear so much progressive rock and you're always going into at least a 10-minute epic, is this album comes at you snappily, and the side flies. It's got that thing where they're little jewels. You put it on and you get this little song, and it's a little world, and it's not samey because Tim is exploring all these different palettes of sound. It contains possibly the worst guitar sound I've ever heard, which sounds like someone playing electric guitar not plugged in, recorded on a phone. And if it is that, then I have been very astute. But the sort of lo-fi stuff is wound into some very lush arrangements and instrumentation. And Stephen Wilson, I believe, has mixed this, and he's given it an incredible sound. There's certain points where I really like the fact that the voice seems divorced from the music, and tracks start off and they seem disjointed. It's what I really loved about I Was There. It starts off and it's all very disjointed, and then suddenly opens up. And so the viewpoint that is within this is it's all slightly alienating. It's all slightly coming from an area of perhaps the whole album is expressing a forlorn quality of regret, of coming from a place where you are looking back with a mixture of nostalgia and regret. That's what I feel. It's very difficult to talk about the musical aspects of this. Tim Bowness is a very intuitive musician because I've worked with him. He's very aware of songwriting and incredibly knowledgeable about his influences and the way music fits in the cultural framework that we're going through at the moment. That's all great. There's a naivety to the approach to the songs, and yet there's a sophistication in the harmony, and there's a sophistication in the rhythms and productions. I really like this album. Whether the prog fans who watch this channel will like this album, I think if you veer towards the outer limits of prog, especially anybody who came up around about my age that grew up with the sort of electro, Gary Newman-esque pop landscape that we came in, especially if you're like a fan of Japan or any of those stuff, you will enjoy this. It's a serious album. It's a very beautiful album, and I'm going to give it a really good review. I'm not going to do 10 out of 10 or anything like that. But it's a great album, so go and check it out. The link's down below. I have with me Mr. Tim Bowness, who, of course, I drum for in our band Butterfly Mind, but also he has a new album out called Powder Dry, which I've been enjoying very much. And it's actually been giving me a different viewpoint about band, Tim. I've been hearing what you do in greater depth. You know, it just proves sometimes when you play for someone, it's worth sitting down and having a good listen to one of their albums. It's a very interesting album, Tim, because the approaches are some of the approaches are very progressive, I would say. But the sort of, I would say, the song or even pop sensibilities mixed with the length of the tracks is very on prog, isn't it?
It is. Well, I did write some longer songs. I mean, this is, for me, it's the first time I've ever done an album where it's all me. And I've always avoided this, although I've played guitar on a few of my things and keyboards on a few of my albums. And I tend to write detailed demos. What I do is I always get people like you, better musicians than me, to replay all of my parts. So a lot of my albums have very good musicians and my compositions. And as I say, I've been sort of writing full demos probably since the early 2000s when I set up my studio, and I've written songs since I started singing. So I've always kind of written songs on guitar or keyboard. And this was, I sort of wrote it in a I would say a burst of 3 creative periods where I'd written 10 pieces each time. So I ended up with about 30 pieces, some of which were of a more conventional length, or perhaps even more ambitious and intricate musically, but I didn't feel as if my personal recordings were doing them justice, which is why I've actually sent them to you and the band, because I think it would be a really good starting point for another album.
Well, I can remember years and years ago, I was still friends with a drummer called Alex Thomas, and he was recording with Badly Drawn Boy, and Badly Drawn Boy hired a very posh producer, and they went in and did a beautiful renditions of his new songs. And when he heard it, he went, "This isn't right," because he basically writes actually quite conventional songs, almost like pop songs, but he needed the production to have more edge, be more quirkier, more wrong in a way, to give the songs the balance it needed. And I felt some of the songwriting on this album is so strong, and it goes from sort of quite mournful and quite almost like there's a nostalgia there, but there's also some almost like there's a strong pop sensibility, but it's balanced by your production style, which is sort of sophisticated and naive at the same time. I said in my review that it's possibly got the worst guitar sound on any album in music history, hasn't it?
Well, it's funny because Stephen said similar. I think we did on the Album Years podcast. He actually said, and I mean this as a compliment, it's got the worst guitar sound.
Oh, glad we agree. It has. It has.
I'm not quite sure whether to take it as a compliment here, but yeah, I did record the electric guitar in bizarre ways. The thing is that I wanted to capture, so a lot of the music. So I've written all sorts of eclectic pieces in the past, and I think that this is probably the most eclectic album, though I'm the least competent musician I work with. I think that allows me to work in extremes. So I think the album does go from perhaps the poppiest I've ever been to the most experimental I've ever been.
Yeah.
To the smoothest I've ever been to the roughest, because the idea was I would just wake up and I'd be attempting to capture a feeling. It was whatever was in my head that day. And I think the most extreme version, there were 2 tracks, one which didn't make the album, which was called They Come From Nowhere. And it was one of the most dark, dissonant political songs I've ever written. And the next day was Summer Turned, which is perhaps the frothiest.
That's the poppiest one, yes.
Yeah,
That's the
electronic.
one that opens up side two on the vinyl, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
and I love that. And the other thing I loved was because the songs are really short. I mean, you've got like stuff that is barely 2 minutes long, and it's so eclectic that I felt that my interest was held. It was like
yeah,
having a box of sweets, you know. Oh, I really like that. And then just when you were sort of getting fed up with it, you don't realize this when you work in Prague that
yeah,
when you're working in Prague, a lot of the stuff we do can get you have to get the energy to work your way through it all the time, you know, and you can do it.
yeah,
Oh, that's great. You know, it's like, you know, that thing when you're a kid and you first hear Stairway to Heaven, you go, right, I'm going to listen to it. It's 5 minutes long and you muster your strength up and follow it all the way through. But with yours, it was just all this different stuff coming at you. And so there's a lot of anti-prog there, which I think makes it very prog in a way. That's the only way I could describe it. I just really enjoyed your the aesthetic that you've got in terms of the production. And
thank you.
I don't know how much Stephen Wilson played in terms of the mix because it's a beautiful sounding album. But what I found is that there was almost like deliberate points where your voice would come in, and the
Yeah,
voice doesn't quite fit with what's going on, and then you go, "Whoa, oh, what's going on here?" And then suddenly it just all pulls together. There, it's not
yeah.
there's a lot of storytelling in the production, in the mix, and also in the arrangement of the instruments.
Well, Stephen mixed it rather than produced it. So a lot of this, you know, the sonic ideas and the
Yeah,
contrasts, they were all there before he
yeah,
had the tapes. And I can mix. It's not a thing I can mix, but I can tend to mix when I'm doing either noise or ambient pieces. So I'm confident with myself that I can do pure noise
mm,
and vocal loop ambience and texture
mm,
pieces, which those don't sound so different from what's actually on the album. Where I'm less confident with myself is kind of having a fuller, more panoramic sound. And I kind of trust Stephen to know exactly what I have in my mind with that. And yeah, I think one of the things you point out, which is interesting, is that I did record some songs. So the one indulgence I had on the album was I bought about 5 microphones while I was doing this because I wanted to record the songs with different microphones. And so I would sometimes record one song with 5 different microphones just to see which one worked the best, which one was the most interesting, which texture. And I came down in the end to 2 microphones, and it was ironically the most expensive microphone I had and the cheapest. They were the ones that had the sound that I really wanted for the
mm,
tracks. And so you're right that there was a real, and I've always done this kind of with my demos. There's a juxtaposition of very sophisticated sound. So I'd be using quite sophisticated keyboard textures and quite sophisticated microphones, and then would be recording the guitar in the most stupid way imaginable to get something interesting. So quite often I'd be using the worst electric guitar I had in the house and recording it through microphones of various kinds and then processing that electronically. So in the end, you have electric solos that are processed from an acoustic source, but it's an electric guitar, is that
mm,
acoustic source. And sometimes you just hit on something. So there's one sound that I was really pleased with that's on the title track, Powder Dry. And I liked it so much that I used it at the very end of the album. And the last track is mostly an electronic piece and it's called Built to Last, but it ends on this crushing one note guitar. And that was actually one note that was recorded on the electric guitar acoustically, then processed, then overdubbed, processed, overdubbed, processed. So
mm.
you've got maybe about 10 guitars with different levels of distortion on them. And yes, I've always kind of liked this idea of playing with beauty and with absolutely horrific amateurishness. So sometimes you have a combination of complete control and then chaos within it. And I guess these are things I've always
Mm.
liked to play with. And because I was left to my own devices entirely, I could just do that to my heart's content.
Yes, and I think because if you're fundamentally a songwriter, you don't get what's the word you don't get pulled down towards a certain instrument that, oh, I've got to make sure that's correct, or I've got to make sure that's correct. So there's no investment in the bass or the drums. It feels like
No.
everything can be taken and destroyed and put back together. I really felt that the spirit of Brian Eno was over it. There's something that I loved about, especially the '70s Brian Eno albums, where
Yeah.
he was flirting with writing sort of pop songs in his own way, and but taking them through a production approach, which was very, I mean, a huge influence on me. Wasn't
Mm.
rooted in trying to create quality, but was more trying to create interest or
I think this is it. It's like creating ideas. I think one of the things, again, you touched on was I had about 30 pieces, of which I drew 16. And the most time-consuming process was sequencing the album because, I'm still an obsessive about an album. And so for me, it had to be 40 minutes and it had to have these dynamic arcs. So although the pieces are all individual and are all very different from one another, and they exist as self-contained units, I very much in the end saw it as an album experience where I didn't want the listener to get bored. What I wanted was to convey a lot of the ideas that I've been experimenting with, and for it as a 40-minute experience to have this arc of violence, beauty, sophistication, primitive wildness. And so that at no point in the album would you get bored. This was part of the
that's
methodology
really what
behind
that was experience. I can say that worked, and also that side one is quite dark. There's lots of themes of sort of being dislocated or alienated or sort of removed from things and wanting to be removed and high, being hidden or lost.
yeah.
All this is stuff is there, and I thought, God, this is quite dark though. It's playful, but it's dark. And then when you put side two on, because obviously I've got the vinyl, and this is one of the things we forget with CDs, so you get to the end of the album, and I
Mm.
actually take a bit of a break, when I went for the toilet or something, came back, put the second side on, and it's all sunshiny. And although it does go dark, the side two is actually a little bit more opulent. And you've got
Right.
quite a long track. I can't remember the title of it, quite a long track. And this incredible fuzzy bass line comes in, this great big drum beat. And
Yeah.
so it that almost acted as a climax, and then it came down. So I think you've done a brilliant job with it. The problem is with this sort of approach, it's very difficult to take out live. So I suppose we've got to now
Yeah.
go away and have a think. And I haven't, I listened to it objectively because the only time I've ever listened to your stuff in recent times is when I've got to drum on it. So I'm thinking, what shall I do? How does this go? And all, how many bars is there? But actually sitting down and listening to it, it was quite inspiring to try and get a bit of that aesthetic live. Try and get that sort of amateurish with sophistication in terms of the sound. And it would be nice, I think, because I think with Butterfly Mind, it's quite a big. It's always very opulent, isn't it? And it might be nice to try and strip things back to just like degraded.
Raw and lean of a band. I think, there is a kind of what I like about it is it's a five-piece guitar rock band in a way.
Mm.
And I think, we've done a couple of tracks from the album, and I particularly liked what we did with Idiots at Large because again, it emphasizes the very sweet verses and the industrial pummeling of the choruses. And I think the band, as always, I think whenever you, John, Matt, and Rob attempt the material, you redefine it in your own image. And I really like that. So for me, I'm very open to
But when
hearing what
but when I heard
you.
it, you see, when it goes really heavy and dark, it's
Yeah.
got this drum sound which is so distressed. And what I've done is transferred it to the floor tom, and I'm going dum 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 dum. So I'm basically doing Georges of the Jungle under it. And I know it's sort of working, but I was just wondering whether that drum at that point I could put something on it that distresses it in the same way. So it really has got me thinking. It's a sort of futuristic modernist approach to production, which everyone has sort of forgotten because the digital audio workstations will now will just produce pristine. So
Yeah.
I think you've done a really brilliant job to use that technology, but still treat it like you've got an old four-track
Exactly.
cassette Porter Studio, because
Exactly. And
there's that sound there.
I love the quality of Porter Studio recordings. You know, that's one of my favorite. You know, I think when home studios got more sophisticated in the late 80s, which I can live with that, the cleanliness, the purity, but I really missed the grunge of the early Porter studios. And it had a real character. And I suppose what you're right, to a certain extent, there was an aspect of combining the best of what's available now, that purity and clarity and quality, the bit rate, with the degraded nature of early Porter Studio. And it was sometimes, I say, about capturing ideas. And I think you are right that in principle, I think that two things that were sort of an influence in the background, they weren't a conscious influence because none of it was really self-conscious. I think that Eno's 70s work, you're right, you know, when he was flirting with extreme experiments, with pop songs, and again with the birth of ambience, definitely, I've always adored those albums, and Eno has been, you know, a huge influence since the beginning. And no, I've never used them. I've got some of his oblique strategies. I've got some of the original 70s oblique strategies. And another one who was doing interesting albums around the same time, I think, was Peter Hamill, where he got his own studio after Van de Graaf split up. And he was experimenting at home. And again, he's a pretty decent pianist and he's a great vocalist, but he's not so proficient at guitar and bass and mandolin. But he just throw them in because it would be, I want that texture. And then I want that texture, but I'm actually going to fuck it up with tons of distortion.
Well,
And
the thing
okay,
is,
and I suppose that
I,
that
I think this,
mindset is probably in the back of my
I
mind.
think one of the things that's been forgotten at the moment with music is fundamentally music is down to our choice, isn't it? It's like in the end, you get all bogged down with thinking about, release dates and production and all these different things you need to do and the artwork and you've got to get it mastered and mixed. But in the end, it always comes down to the fact that you're just making a decision of what you think sounds good in the
Yeah,
context of what you're trying to do, and my new studio, I've been walking around this factory with these two soft mallets, just playing bits of the factory, and I've been
right.
filming myself doing it because I was trying to make a video that expressed basically fundamentally what music making is, and it's you go out and you find something that sounds nice. And so this idea that you pick up a guitar or piano or even a trombone and you can't really play it, but you could still experiment and come up with something that you feel is you. And I think that's been forgotten. We all get bogged down in the technicalities. And I felt that with your album, there's a joy of just, it, whatever, and it's a
Yeah.
very hard thing to put into words, but I'm hoping I'm getting across because I think, um, there's an audience out there in the prog world that loves this stuff. And I don't know that whether there's that many people doing it nowadays. So hopefully, those who do love these albums, like the Eno albums or My Life in a Bush of Ghosts, which is another album
Yeah,
that's hugely influential on me,
wonderful
or
record.
the
Yeah,
early material stuff, Bill Laswell, and
yeah,
all that mixture of experimental, forward-looking production with a sort of almost like guerrilla recording approach. Your album is that it's opulent and yet the opposite of opulent, whatever that is, Tim.
What, but I think yeah, and I think one of the things that again is that although some of this obviously is played in real time, so there are a couple of tracks which are more obvious singer-songwriter,
Mm.
but some of the keyboard tracks as well were played in real time and what have you. But what I tried to do, even with the pieces that were more programmed or loop based, I would always play over it. So I'd play keyboards or guitar over it to, in a sense, add human error. Because one of the things I didn't want in this era of electronic recordings where you've got Beat Detective and auto
Mm.
tune, luckily I don't know how to use auto tune. So I just kind of record the vocal. And the way in which I tend to do this with vocal is I don't know how you operate in this, but I tend to sort of do anything from 5 to 20 vocal takes that I can do really quickly. Sometimes, as I've said, with different microphones, five
Mm.
different just to test this. And then you're cutting between this, finding the best takes. And sometimes once you've got the best takes, recording it again in the light of that. So I suppose that, being a singer and being a songwriter, the vocals are the things that were more beautifully recorded or
Your vocals are beautiful on there. It's a lovely singing on there. I love that Englishness. I think it's the only way to go, really. If you're a British songwriter, you should be like Scott Walker or Petula Clark and sing in your accent. And I think that just puts a spin, because there's certain points which, if you were singing in a more blues derived voice, you've got stuff that is pretty much dance music at certain points. You've got,
yeah.
it's house music, and it would, before you know it, it would be in a completely different area. So your voice centers everything. A great album, and hopefully we can go forward with it. So I'm happy to review it, Tim, and I hope they all go out and buy it now. And it's interesting to do this, to actually sit down and listen to someone's album and then chat about it and explore what it's about, because good thing to do. So
Well, I think, and you've tapped into the fact that I think it was using the studio and using instruments almost like a play box. There was that kind of, and the stupid thing is that, although I know basic chords on guitar and keyboard, but I often play things I don't know what the hell it is. I really don't know any advanced music theory. I'm not you, who can play every single instrument brilliantly. And I think sometimes it allows me to make mistakes. One of my favorite comments from Stephen was Warm Up Man Forever, which I wrote. Now, to me, that sounds totally logical. And Stephen always says, you do realize that no proper musician would do that verse to chorus transition that you did. And of course I don't, because it's just what sounded right when I was playing the keyboards. And I suppose this is the thing, that it's playing instruments and it's music, yeah, as a joyful, playful toy box experience. And when I was recording some of the things, there's a track I dropped and I'd accidentally played quite well, actually, for me, this John Barry-esque Vic Flick style guitar, and thought, oh, that's how you do it. And it almost is a process of discovery. And of course, as soon as I'd recorded it, I'd forgotten what I'd played. And bar the obvious strum along singer-songwriter things, which I can play you,
yeah,
I actually forget. So on a track like Rock Hudson, I'm playing the guitar on that chorus. And while I was doing it, thinking, oh, that's interesting. Obviously, the worst sounding guitar in history, but I'm playing thinking, I can do this. I now no longer know what I played, but
well, I've got to be honest. I use the same approach as you. I do know the harmony, but I often will just put my fingers down on the guitar and come up with the chords, and especially my keyboard playing, and then I can't play it afterwards. I really am thinking about this a lot. This idea of focusing more on the fact that it's my choice or our choice, and we're just going to find something that we think sounds good, and not think so much about what in effect cliches, aren't they? All the other stuff is just cliches. It's the process in which everybody did it before, but every single person that did that originally was just prattling about and going, oh, I like that. And I think it's when you hear that on a record, it inspires me. And then I want to go out and make music rather than somebody bashing me over the head with how good they are. I'm fed up with that at the moment. I'm going, oh, yes, you're really good. You are really competent. Brilliant. I want to feel inspired, which I did after your album. And it's great. So thanks for coming on, Tim. I don't want to keep this really long because I've got a great long review, and I'm doing what I've done is I've done you and Soft Machine. The last I've reviewed the Soft Machine album. And the idea is that these are the two limits of prog. You're at one end of prog here, actually here, and then Soft Machine at the other end. But you actually joined in a strange sort of way, which is probably Theo Travis. That's the join. But anyway, Jake, thanks for having us on. Thanks for having you on.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, and I will now get back to the review.
Right, shall we move on now to this one? Now, this one is called Other Doors. It's by Soft Machine. Right. Now, there's a connection of me to Tim Bowness because I play with Tim Bowness. And every now and then we have a special guest. We have Theo Travis, who comes in on saxophone. I am very pleased to have Theo Travis here, who's going to tell us a little bit about this album that I am doing a review of. So, can you give us a little bit of background on it?
Okay, well, it was going to be, in fact, it was the last ever recording of John Marshall, because at the time we recorded it, John, he'd been unwell for a while, and he was doing some of the gigs, but not all of the gigs. And so there was a question mark as to whether he'd be okay to do it. And John Etheridge, in particular, was very keen that this was going to be his swan song, and we'll work around John, and we were going to make it his final album. So we were quite well prepared, and we had a lot of new music. And we'd booked a really nice studio, John Heisman's studio, the drummer from Colosseum. And he has a lovely studio in Surrey, although he sadly passed away a few years ago. But his studio was still running. So we booked it, and we went in, and we'd rehearsed, and we did the sessions. And John Marshall was fantastic. We did 3 really good days, and we got loads of material. And what we'd actually done was we had 3 days booked, and then we were going to wait, I think, 2 weeks, and then we were going to have another couple of days in case we wanted to redo anything, do some overdubs. And in the meantime, John's back went, and he just, when it came to those 2 days, he just could not, he couldn't make it. So, but amazingly, we had enough material, plenty of material from those first few days for the whole album, and some extras, because when we did the vinyl release, side 4 is a load of bonus tracks.
Oh, brilliant.
In fact, including a really good drum solo of John's. So we actually put that on, and then we had some improvisations, and we did a few trio improvisations, just John Etheridge, Fred, and myself, and then a couple of extra things. But the tracks John Marshall did were absolutely fantastic, and it was actually the very last time I think he ever played the drums in public. So, but we were very pleased with how the album came out. I'd done quite a lot of sort of pre-production work in terms of some of the soundscapes and some of the electronica and things, and the cover, we got Lasse Hoyle, who I knew through Stephen Wilson. He'd done a lot of his covers, and he was keen to do it. So we were really pleased how the album came out, and it got some nice reviews, and we've been touring it since it came out. I think it was July 2023, so just over a year.
Yeah.
And
I'm
yeah,
a bit late coming to it.
Sorry, go on.
I said I'm a bit late coming to it, but I'm in the car and in my studio all day. It's a fantastic album. To my ears, it sounds like you were all playing in the same room at the same time. Is that correct?
We absolutely were. It's very much part of the Soft Machine way of being and way of working, that people play together. We all come from a jazz background, and so that's what musicians do. We play together, we spark off each other. Sometimes things go a little this way or a little that way, but if we're all doing it together or responding to each other, then that's fine. It's not all kind of just done to a click track, all separately recorded weeks apart, and everything's theoretically perfect and as we say, on the grid, so everything's mapped exactly. There's a little bit of elasticity sometimes in the rhythms or the time or the feel. But hey, that's music,
but that's what makes it better. That's what I really loved about it, and I could hear it. There's so many fusion albums that someone said, check this band out, and you put it on, and it just sounds so clinical. And also, I think when everybody's overdubbing their parts separately, they try too hard to impress. But when you're in the moment, you can't impress, can you? Because the band's leading the way, and you just end up doing what you do. You can't go, well, I'm going to take that again, or I came a bit late in there, I'll do that solo again. So okay. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you. And I mean, a lot of my favorite albums, from the early 70s or whatever, they didn't play to click tracks. And now you sort of listen back with 2024 ears, and you go, well, that's not exact, and this isn't that. And you can hear funny edits, and you can hear, people kind of slightly, I mean, some classic albums. I was listening to Herbie Hancock's Headhunters. There's some kind of weird edits, but with the grooves like amazing. And when they played together, they played together. Some of the Led Zeppelin albums, you just know that they were in the room and it was bloody loud, and they were just, vibing off those.
Yes,
it's real. And and you, as you say, you kind of feel the organicness, even if it's not, technically perfect in whatever that means. I'm not even sure.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I was a bit apprehensive about John Marshall's performance. He's such a brilliant drummer, but obviously I knew he was quite frail. But the drum is incredible.
It's absolutely incredible.
He had a very unique style. I mean,
Yeah.
he grew up in an era where you'd be playing every day, and you do weeks and weeks at Ronnie Scott's, and with Soft Machine the tours were really long, and it was an era where people learnt to play before click tracks. People played a lot,
Mm.
but it wasn't, studios weren't click track, and that was sort of mid 70s. I think that sort of started coming in, and it wasn't, all the time. So John kind of developed this very uh, rolling kind of organic way, but with a lot of passion and fire in his playing. Um, and he's a great listener and a great melodist and a great improviser, and he used to enjoy those aspects a lot. So hopefully those various aspects of his style came out. And it's interesting because we toured America with John in 2018-19, and we'd play some quite, high pressure sort of American fusion places. Like, for example, we did the Baked Potato in Los Angeles. It was quite a kind of studio hangout. And when we were playing, that guy Thundercat, he came along, and
Really?
Danny Carey from Tool was there. And Danny Carey was going absolutely crazy over John. He worshipped him. And I was sort of half thinking, well, Danny Carey's a younger generation, and he will have learned on a click, and his playing's fantastic, but he's got the sort of ears where you hear every kind of microsecond, and maybe someone who's a little bit more fluid, a little bit more rolling, they might think, oh, that's not right. But he absolutely loved it, and he could obviously hear the music in John's playing and how he did what he did, and was very enthusiastic. So that was kind of, I thought, quite interesting in a way.
Oh, that's brilliant. And how was Fred Baker integrated into the band?
Well, Fred, interestingly, we knew Fred. Fred had played with us before. In fact, going back 10 years, Fred did some
Mm.
depths, played with us. And so he knew John, and he'd actually done some other gigs with John Marshall, I think in Germany with something else. So they knew each other and had played together and liked the way each other played as well. In fact, one thing that John Etheridge didn't say on the microphone is that when Roy Babington retired, he kind of nominated Fred. He said, I think he should do the gig, which kind of fitted with what we were thinking anyway. But John Marshall was very happy to play with Fred. In fact, after the sessions that he did, that we obviously became the album, we heard from John's wife that he was particularly happy that he got to make the album with Fred, with the band, and that he, did what he did, and that it all came out well. And they had a very good relationship, Fred and John, which is, as you know, the relationship between the bass player and the drummer, and the bass playing and the drumming, is kind of crucial in any band. And they, locked well, and they liked what each other did well. And I think, they each brought something out of the other's playing as well.
I noticed looking at the credits that some of the compositions are spread around the band, but there's some other ex-Soft Machine members in there. Is that right? Is there a Kevin Ayres composition?
Well, that's right. There is, yes. So there's two things. One is that sometimes when we go into the studio, we'll like to bring something in that we've been doing live quite a bit. Sometimes maybe one or two of the older compositions, because Soft Machine's always been a band where when there's a new lineup, they kind of start again. So when Carl Jenkins started, it was like, well, we're not going to do the old stuff, and then someone else will come, and we're not going to do the old stuff. Whereas we don't kind of look at it as, it is a band with a long and varied history. But I personally like to visit the different periods. So
Yes.
so on the gigs we do, particularly Sir Carl Jenkins, we do some of his stuff. And we do Hugh Hopper's things, and we do some of Mike Ratledge things. Now, the way Joy of a Toy came about, I think, I can't remember if it was me or Roy Babington that originally thought of the idea. I think I did. And then we tried it, and it kind of didn't work. But when Fred came in, it suited him perfectly, because it's effectively a bass melody, a bass solo.
Yeah.
And whereas Roy is more of a kind of bottom end kind of player, Fred is a soloist, so he just jumped at the chance. And when we said, well, let's try it, he loved it. And it's kind of fun to do something that goes way back to the very first Soft Machine album, because, it's a very quirky, whimsical album of its time. There's a lot of love for that album. And so a lot of the tracks are vocal tracks, but that one is an instrumental, and it features bass. And I thought it'd be fun to try it out with the band, and it worked well. Fred really liked it and does a brilliant job on it. So when we came to recording, we thought, well, we'll record it. We won't necessarily use it on the album because we recorded more than we used. But we recorded it and it came out well, and it was kind of a nice thing to do to, look back to the earliest days of Soft Machine and include it with a lot of, contemporary stuff as well. So and people respond to it well on gigs as well. So we've been playing it quite a lot live, and it's kind of fun to do.
The thing that's charming about it is that it's got this sort of Scottish sound, hasn't it? It's got that sort of drony.
It's got that. It's got all sorts of things. It's got this very kind of silly, almost childlike melody. It's very major key, happy, smiley, which Soft Machine generally does not do.
Yeah.
But
I feel that all this is missing from jazz or whatever improvised music. All this is missing. And I think it's incredible that on my way home, because I left the gig last night, and the bridge in Bewdley was shut. So I went down another lane, and I was listening to the album, really enjoyed it, and I realised I'd just driven down the wrong lane, and I was completely lost. It took me a long time to get home, and I only live about 6 minutes away. So that was the first time I listened all the way through it. And I thought, isn't it interesting that the original Soft Machine lasted from sort of 67 through to the early 80s? So we're sort of 13, 14 years. But this reconstituted Soft Machine has been going for like 20 years now.
Yeah, no, it's true. And when you say it's true, and when you say the original Soft Machine was 13 years, of course, that was like 12 Soft Machines. The original Soft Machine with David Allen barely lasted a year. And then there was the trio, and then that was like a year and a half or something. And then they were all like, 1 or 2 years. And then, it settled down, it barely settled down a bit because then, Mike Ratledge left and Carl Jenkins joined, and then Hugh Hopper left. So even some of the classic stuff, like the Soft Machine third lineup, it was there for 5 minutes.
Exactly. And I thought, where's the band I saw last night, the cohesion was incredible. Obviously, you've just come off a 17-date tour of the States, so everybody was on fire and they were relaxed. And I sat in that room, and some moments were Ornette Coleman level for improvisation. You were right, and I thought, isn't this wonderful that you've been around the world playing improvised music and at that level and able to pull that off, because it's so hard for jazz groups to be able even to play something that's a little bit more commercial. It's difficult to find the gigs. So Soft Machine is, I think you at the moment it's like a juggernaut, and I think the people watching the channel need to go and check this out, because I think you are really flying the flag for improvised music, which of course I totally champion, and I think we need more of it. And I really did enjoy it last night. So, and the album's fantastic. I love the production as well. I was surprised when the drums came in. There was quite a bit of reverb, and it was warm, and it just feels loose, and it just feels there's a lot of vibe there, which is what I like. So, I've obviously given it a good review. So like you said, you've got a few more dates to do now.
Yes. Well, November, we kind of got a bit of a British tour. So out and about. And then there's, I think, a bit of a gap. And there's one in February. And then there's a load more in March. Hopefully, we're playing in Worcester, actually, in March. I don't think it's 100% confirmed, but I think Huntingdon Hall, or there's a hall in Worcester.
Yes, I've played that many a time myself.
Right. Okay. Well, hopefully that'll happen. So we'll be back in the area, which would be great.
The last gig I saw at Huntingdon Hall was in the summer, and it was the John Lydon spoken word.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was great. It was fantastic. We snuck round the back to try and say hello to him, but he didn't. He was no, but we did wave at him and say hello, John. So yeah.
Oh, you're frozen.
Am I back now?
Did he tell you to F?
No, he was quite polite. He just said, "Oh, I'm just getting my breath." He was like, "Well, he's the bloke with him anyway." But when are you going to go into the studio to do the next album with Asaf Circus, your new drummer?
Yeah, we're planning to. It kind of depends on people's schedules. People are pretty busy. I think we're all pretty busy up to the end of November. So hopefully sometime between December and February, but it's just tying everyone down, not just to record, but to write. Well, we've got some stuff written, but to rehearse it and get it all ready and then go in and do it all. So it would be nice if he could record then, and then there's the whole kind of scheduling of how it would be
Because
when it'll be released.
he's perfect for the gig, isn't he? He's got such a melodic way of playing as well. I thought, watching him last night, and very interesting.
Melodic. He's very powerful, but he also really likes the free improvised sort of areas. And you need a pretty broad set of tools to play in soft machine, because you need to be able to hit it hard, but you need to be able to not play at all and to freely improvise, and and just be sympathetic to the music, or whichever music we're playing at the time. And he does like all the things we do, and he knows the history of soft machine, and it's worked very well. I have to say, it's worked very well with us. So it's a good fit.
And right in the middle of it, of course, is John Etheridge, one of a national treasure in terms of British guitar, isn't he? He's incredible.
Yeah, I mean, he's done everything since when was he? Sort of late 60s, really. And I mentioned this story last night that I do tell people that he did do this gig. It was a club called the Speakeasy on Wardour Street, and John was playing in various bands around that time, and there was this new guitarist in town, and he had been looking to find him, and he came down to the gig, and at the end of the gig he walked up to John and said, I really loved your guitar playing, fantastic guitar playing, and they spoke about guitar, really great playing, man. And it was Jimi Hendrix. And
incredible, absolutely incredible. Yeah, he's got such a broad palette of the way he plays, and right at the end of the gig, you did Hazard Profile, which of course is famous for being Alan Holdsworth's.
Yeah.
Sort of launched Alan Holdsworth onto the world, really.
Yeah.
And John took off, and I felt like I was floating out of my chair. It was incredible, And so, yeah, I brilliant album. I think Soft Machine are at full force at the moment, and I want to champion that as much as I possibly can. So thanks for talking to us and telling us a little bit about the album. And hopefully, Theo, at some point we'll get you on to do a proper interview and go through your illustrious career. Because, of course, we recently on the channel did the 10 greatest modern progressive rock albums. And you, of course, were on number 1 and number 2. Were you on Hand Cannot Erase?
Yeah, a couple of 2 or 3 tracks. Yeah.
I don't know that album so well, but yeah. So yeah, you made the top spot and the second spot, which is pretty.
Wow.
So we've got to get in there and talk about all the other stuff that you've done at some point. But thanks for coming on, and I hopefully will see you soon, maybe in December.
Yep, I hope so. I think I'll see you then. Okay.
Brilliant. Thank you
very much.
So I've got to know Theo Travis a little bit. Now, Theo is very interesting because he comes from that world of jazz. He has listened to the Brecker Brothers and John Coltrane and Stan Getz. But he has gone from that world, which I come from as well. I love all that. And he's moved across to progressive rock, a little like I have. In talking to him, I discovered his love of new wave and British heavy metal bands like Saxon, which we had a very interesting talk about, and Motorhead. So, same age as me, same sort of background in music. That I find that very interesting. And he is playing with Soft Machine. Now, Soft Machine, if Tim is at one end, if we could see Tim as representing the back end of sort of classic prog, that sort of electro experimentation that then influenced rock music, if he's exploring that outer limit, then Soft Machine represent the other outer limit, when progressive music was just music that was blowing your mind. And Soft Machine emerged in 1967 at the same time as sort of Pink Floyd. They embodied a sort of psychedelic aesthetic. They wanted to blow your mind. They went off around the States with Jimi Hendrix. And what they were doing was actually a sort of British jazz that utilised rock instrumentation and sort of pop song aesthetics in the early days. But as Soft Machine developed, it moves very slowly, especially with with Robert Wyatt leaving, and then his eventual accident that crippled him, and his move towards singer-songwriting. So what was in Soft Machine in the early days, a part of it moves out to Robert Wyatt, and then the improvisational thing moves into the band that exists, and they have a whole catalogue of musicians, which according to John Etheridge, who's the guitarist on this, was pretty angry and what's the word? The 70s incarnations of Soft Machine. There was a lot of arguments. There was a lot that they weren't cohesive units, right? And I think when I listen to the albums, I can hear that, Soft Machine is continually going from one line up to the next. It never quite settles. And in doing that, it never quite develops a band feel in the same way that, say, ELP do or Led Zeppelin. But there is a vibe. And Soft Machine represents almost like that Canterbury vibe, a whimsical British, in their case, take on improvisation. And I'm going to call this rock improvisation. Of course, it's informed from the free jazz, bebop, and then the jazz fusion that was predating it all. And they actually played a part in its creation. So, Soft Machine were playing very close to where I live last night. So before I knew it, I was on the guest list. So I went down and I sat in this gig and I watched this gig. And I know about Soft Machine and I've listened to a lot of the albums. And they start playing and I could hear a cohesion. I'm very aware that what is ever on those albums that we grew up with, like third and fourth and fifth and bundles and softs, all that stuff. This band is actually pulling from all different areas. At one point, they do the very first single, which I think was called Joy is a Toy, and it's a bass solo, and it's very quirky, and they do that. And then the next thing, they're doing Hazard Profile, and John Etheridge is just burning. Now, John Etheridge is the, if we wanted to say a classic member, he's the last classic member remaining. He wasn't a founder member, but he took over from Alan Holdsworth, that was in the band briefly in around about 74 to 75. He came in after Bundles, and then he stayed there all the way up till their demise in the early 80s. And then in 2004, the band has come back together. And Soft Machine has existed since 2004, making albums. And that lineup has been a lot more stable. Now, in the early days, that would have been Hugh Hopper. It would have been John Etheridge. It would have been John Marshall on drums, and for anyone I'm forgetting, I think Elton Dean on saxophone. And then, of course, being men of a certain age, and some of them living, not necessarily an aesthetic lifestyle, they started to die, is the only way I can explain this. Elton Dean dying first, then followed by, I think, Hugh Hopper. When Hugh Hopper died, then they replaced him with Roy Babington, who was another original member from the 70s. So this Soft Machine, in a way, was a much more cohesive Soft Machine that has existed for the last 20 years. So when we approach this album, the mistake to make is to consider it in terms of what happened 50 years ago. There is a lot of time in between that, and there's a hiatus, and then there's the reforming. And that band has got a history which I think is actually more interesting, and I want to focus on that. Now, last year they were down to two original members, John Marshall, who took over from Robert Wyatt in the early 70s, and John Etheridge. I actually supported Soft Machine, I think a year or two before, and at that point, John Marshall was quite frail, but mighty on the drums. John Marshall has always been one of my favourite drummers. But last year they went into the studio, and we have here the last recording of this great British drummer, John Marshall, on here. Augmented by Theo Travis, as I said, on saxophone, and the great Fred Thelonious Baker, also known to us as Fred Baker. I've known Fred, not very well, but I've known Fred for over 30 years. He's one of the greatest bass players this country has ever produced, an absolute virtuoso. The first time I saw him was opening up for Alan Holdsworth, and he came out and did a solo bass routine. I was so amazed by it. I told my mates at the college I taught at, and we found out it was in Birmingham. And then we brought him over to my college, and he taught my students an incredible thing. And then I did one jam session with Fred, which is very memorable. Fred's an incredible player. And with the passing of John Marshall, they have brought in on the gig last night Asaf Circus, who isn't on this album, but is an incredible drummer. There's an evolution that has happened to this incarnation of Soft Machine, which is entirely different to the one we think of the 70s. And what I heard last night was a band exploring this catalogue, but with a consolidated approach to improvisation, which is Soft Machine. And it's improvisation which takes its lead from all aspects of jazz, right through to free jazz, avant-garde jazz, but it's embodied with a rock aesthetic, a heaviness, and also a very British approach. The British fusion bands, if we think of things like Morrissey and Mullen and Brand X and Barbara Thompson's Paraphernalia and Nucleus, I think the hardest and toughest is Soft Machine. And although it's there on those 70s albums, and these are classic albums and the compositions are incredible, they're historic, I really want to champion this current incarnation of Soft Machine. So what is this album like? It opens up with the sax and guitar. There is a way that the saxophone entwines with guitar, which I think was taken from sort of Uncle Meat era Frank Zappa, but has been channeled to create a very signature sound, which I enjoy very much. I love a little bit of distorted guitar playing unison lines with saxophone, but this actually starts up quite ethereal, and it moves into quite an intense composition, which says here, Penny Hitch is by Jenkins, which I assume is Carl Jenkins, who obviously was a member of Soft Machine in the 70s, as has now gone on to become a very famous composer, and he's got a knighthood. And we've got bits of compositions that they do Joy of a Toy, they redo that on here. Anyway, track 3, Other Doors, the title track. There's a heaviness in this that is seldom apparent in jazz fusion. It's a heaviness that I hear in King Crimson, it's a heaviness that I hear in the Mahavishnu Orchestra, and it's a heaviness that I heard last night. And I love it. And you realise that Soft Machine have a stake in this. John Etheridge is one of the great British guitar players. He could go between sounding like Carlos Santana all the way through to Alan Holdsworth with all the jazz vocabulary. I mean, this guy's played guitar for Stefan Grappelli. That is always the worst gig you could ever do, to be able to try and step into the shoes of Django Reinhardt. His jazz vocabulary is incredible, but he also is pulling from aspects of Ornette Coleman. I think the track Crooked Usage is very Ornette Coleman influence. I love to hear a band, a modern jazz rock band, not just jumping through the hoops of conformity and cliche, but being able to go and explore those other aspects of jazz which make people uncomfortable. Last night, we sat through a good 15 minutes of proper free jazz, and free jazz that wasn't like the 60s free jazz, because John and Theo were using so much electronics and creating so much soundscapes within this twirling stuff. I was blown away last night. I really was. I mean, I've seen a ton of fusion bands, and you have to search. You've always had to search for the stuff, the good stuff. Well, this version of Soft Machine's there, and it's on this album. Now, John Etheridge said to me last night that, John Marshall was very frail. The last time his stick hit a drum or cymbal is on this album. But the playing is mighty. It's a lesson to hear an absolute master who maybe technically is restricted, but in their view, because when he said this, I thought, I hope the drumming's not, because I just watched Asaf Circus. He's such a virtuoso drummer that I was just like, oh my God, I wonder what John. But the drumming is incredible in here. It's someone, you know what makes a good drummer? And I realised this listening to this album. It's not the technique, it's not the groove, it's not the feel, it's not how many drums they've got or how cool they are. It is their ability to do the right thing at the right time. This is what makes John Marshall an absolute monster. This is what makes John Etheridge and all of them, is that in this very highly improvisational setting, they do the right thing. And when you listen to something like this and you are enjoying it, that is the message that you get. So here in these two albums, we have the outer limits of progressive rock, right? This is probably so far out towards the jazz, improvisational, experimental end that, you know, would a normal progressive rock fan be able to take this? And this is probably too far out into the experimental, electronic, pop sensibility end, right? But it's linked in a way. These two things are together, and I can't explain how it is. And it's the link between these two albums that make it progressive rock. Fantastic album for the people who like lyrics and songs. And for the people who like jazz rock, go and check this out. This is a brilliant album. And it does not have the blight which so many modern fusion albums have. And I really wish I could put my finger on it of what it is. But it's an abandonment. It's a wish to have fun, to explore musical sounds and not to sit there trying to impress the audience. And if I'm not wrong, I think they all went into the room and played at the same time. You see, this lineup, they have a keyboardist because Theo Travis is playing keyboards. When I saw him live, he was playing some keyboards, but when they got down to it, they were dealing with bass, guitar, saxophone, drums, and there was a certain aesthetic within that I really enjoyed as well, a certain space for improvisation to happen. And I can hear it on this album, which suggests to me that Theo is not overdubbing all his keyboard parts and then putting his saxophone parts in, but I could be wrong. But I think there could be something on this which comes from them all playing at the same time. I love the mix on it. I love the production. It's warm and lush. There's quite a bit of reverb on there, which we don't necessarily get on a lot of modern fusion albums, which I absolutely love. This is a great album. Go and check this out. Go and check that out. Thanks for watching. If you like this, please like it. If you subscribe, then that will make this great, because these videos don't do well because none of you are interested in stuff that's new. So much as you will come on here in the comments and say, you never listen to new music, never talk about new music, you look at the view count on this. It's important to support new music, and I will support the music that is linked to me. These are two brilliant albums, really, honestly. Go and check them out. Thanks for watching.